Now we are at the Stitzel Weller experience. You come in and they twist your arm and get you to take a cocktail. They don't have to twist your arm too very hard to get you to walk around on the tour with a cocktail there. I'll get outside here in a minute, but this is one of the old Fitzgerald distilleries today.
You guys are here today for the Stitzel Weller experience at 12 o'clock. I'm your tour guide, Chandler. This is a 45-minute walking tour, 15-minute tasting. Hopefully the walking goes by really fast. It's hot and we want to drink some good bourbon. I actually normally take us outside to the front porch and we stand there, but today when we take you to the front porch, we're going to come right in that front door just because it's so hot. If everyone's okay with that? All right, awesome. Follow me, please. All right, a majority, but a few newbies. Awesome. Welcome. Well, Stitzel Weller is pretty different from other distilleries where they focus on the distillation process. We like to focus mainly on our history here. And speaking of our history, it was said that every single morning the founders of this place would come, unlock every door on the property, and then hang their personal set of keys on the little notch that we had hanging these keys right on the other side of this door. We like to do the same. Unfortunately, I won't be able to hang those right this minute, but we like to instill those traditions of Southern hospitality, welcoming anybody in. If you see the keys on the door, we are open. Come have a snack, a drink, and a cigar, which unfortunately we can't enjoy here anymore today. Yes, and I'll talk all about that today. So you might notice that there are multiple keys on this ring. This is not a random number. There are 5 keys that directly represent the 5 keys it takes to make a really good bourbon. You all might recognize some of those keys, so when I'm going through, feel free, shout over me if you forgot or you don't care to remember. My name is Chandler if you have any questions. So that first key, we're starting out strong with our grains. Once your grains have cooked, you're going to add in a little bit of yeast. After yeast is added, fermentation takes place. And once fermentation has taken place, it goes through the distillation process, ultimately ending its life up in a barrel. Those are the 5 keys. And I like to look at the first 2, the grains and yeast, as a foundation to a good bourbon, the same way I look at our history here as the foundation of a really good distillery. So I will be going off that 5 key layout today during our tour. But let's get right into the history. The Stitzels and the Wellers, 2 separate families. You all might recognize one of the names, but I'm going to start with the Wellers. So William Maru Weller got into the whiskey business in 1849. Now what he ultimately became was a wholesaler, distributor, and a rectifier. Y'all heard of rectification before? No. I hadn't heard of it when I came here either, so don't feel bad. To rectify something means to fix it. So basically what William Maru was doing was taking a grain spirit, which was distilled normally, and he was adding in things like brown sugar, molasses, things like that to give it a signature sweetness and that signature bourbon color. Well, you had individuals who were seeing how quickly you could make bourbon without going through all of these steps that it took, distillation, maturation, and they said, I want a quick bite, and they did the exact same, but they took any spirit that they could find. It didn't have to be distilled, and it didn't have to be a grain spirit. They started adding in things like rusty nails, and iodine, and tobacco spit. And sure, I'm sure that did give you a bourbon signature color, but I also am sure it didn't give you that signature flavor. Now, individuals quickly realized that people were becoming sick because of this bad version of rectification, and ultimately sometimes even worse. Now, this is when the Bottled and Bond Act was passed, the first set of rules and regulations for distilling your whiskey. I'll talk a little bit about that when we go through the rest of the building. But that's what the Wellers were doing. And by 1880, they were able to sell their product nationwide. the good kind of rectification, not the bad kind. And they needed to hire on some salesmen to account for this nationwide movement. And so they hired on two young gentlemen. One was a local Shively man. He's actually credited for rehabilitating the bank right here in Shively, the city we are in, the Bank of St. Helens. He went on to become the money man for William LaRue Weller. His name was Alex Farnsley. Now, another young gentleman had just graduated from college. He was looking for his very first job ever at the young age of 19 years old. Now, he was the personality, the salesman, the face. This young gentleman was known as Julian P. Van Winkle. Some of you guys might recognize him as Pappy. Now, Pappy and Alex went on to become William LaRue's best decision ever, and he didn't even realize it at that time. They started out by selling off the backs of horses and eventually upgraded to trains and planes and cars. And so they were helping Weller sell his product nationwide. Now, Weller was also working with his two young sons, who would ultimately go on to take over his company when he decided it was time to pass that torch down to them. Now let's hop over to the Stitzels, who are coming over from Germany in 1859. One master distiller and his three young sons. Their product was so successful because they introduced what is seen as the first four-grained profile for a bourbon. You've got your corn, your rye, your malted barley, but they added a fourth grain, which brought out some of the sugars and that starch, and that fourth grain was wheat. Introduced the very first wheated profile in the United States, allegedly. And so they became popular enough to open up their own distillery right here in downtown Louisville. And he was doing this with his three sons, ultimately under the name Stitzel Brothers Distillery once the father had aged out. Now, the two Weller boys are now in charge of W.L. Weller and Sons by 1912. They see a little movement coming up on the horizon, and they're afraid that whiskey and spirits as a whole might quit selling. This movement is known as the temperance movement. People began saying, oh, wow, alcohol can make you really sick. It can have very negative effects. And so they went out of the business and they went out fast. 4 years later, 1916, they decide to ultimately sell the company for $10,000. Now, I don't know if you all know anything about the Weller brand, but it is worth much more today. They sold that company to two men on the inside, which they had hired and been training for years. None other than Alex Farnsley and Julian P. Van Winkle. Now, Alex and Julian were running the Weller brand, and they no longer wanted to rectify whiskey. They wanted to distill their bourbon and be able to sell it without saying, hey, we rectified. So they asked the Stitzels, can we source 1,000 barrels from you all? The Stitzels had great whiskey, and the Stitzels look at the Weller brands and they're like, well, yeah, you all are so popular. We are definitely going to do that. So in 1916, the two began their mutually exclusive and beneficial relationship. Now, Alex and Julian are going around the nation selling the Stitzels whiskey, and they sell this whiskey so frequently using the 5 keys it takes to make a good bourbon. Now they can say, look, we use grains, yeast, fermentation, distillation, and aging. What are you all going to say? And they became very popular doing this. Now there's still that temperance movement on the horizon, and by 1920, Prohibition hits and the production of all alcohol is to be halted. But don't worry, y'all, there is a catch. At this time, whiskey is seen as medicine. So now, this point in history, you can go to the doctor and get a prescription for a pint of whiskey every 10 days. Every man, woman, and yes, your newborn baby you could take in there. It has a broken toe, you have a broken heart. Whiskey might heal that broken heart at some point. But doctors needed a way to get the whiskey from these distilleries who weren't allowed to produce their whiskey anymore. And so this is when we see the United States government issue 10 medicinal licenses across the nation, allowing these distilleries to sell off their stock to doctors and sometimes even bakers who could use whiskey for baking cakes. Of the 10, 6 were purchased, and of the 6, one was our APH Stitzel, or the Stitzel Brothers Distillery. So the Stitzels are looking over at Alex and Julie and saying, well, you all don't have a medicinal license, but we've been working together exclusively for 8 years. We want to take care of you guys. So the Stitzels did take care of the Weller Company throughout Prohibition. Now, ultimately, with the end of Prohibition in 1933, December 4th, production at this property officially began. They decided, let's just get our own distillery. We are 40 yards from each other in downtown Louisville. And so they choose this location for a number of reasons. The first reason is that there are train tracks going through our bottling line and the building we stand in right now, allowing us to get product supplies that we needed anytime we could. Another main reason this spot was chosen is because Kentucky has fresh flowing, constantly filtered limestone filtered water running below us. So they were able to dig 6 wells on this property. Unfortunately, today we can't use that limestone ran water anymore because chemical plants have come in and unfortunately contaminated Shively. But the last reason that they chose this location is because it was outside of Louisville city limits, whereas everyone else was paying that city tax, which was pretty pricey. We were only paying that federal and state tax, fortunately. Now, ultimately, May 4th, 1935, we officially opened at this location. Any of y'all know what goes on the first Saturday of May around here? A little horse race called the Kentucky Derby, exactly. We had a huge party out on that front lawn, and it all began with the production of our Stillhouse A back in the back that I'm going to take us to look at now. Now, if y'all give me a second, I'm going to hang these keys on the door, and then we're going to go right through this building so we don't have to walk out. And here, y'all have plenty of time to do that after the tour is over today. Come on, we got a big group. All right. The distillery. I tend to stand somewhere around this barrel because I like to be interactive. So if you want to move around a bit. So you notice walking in, we've got a bunch of older machines. Each of these, with the exception of that black box right here, were taken from our Stillhouse A before it was unfortunately deemed unsafe to go into, and they closed it down. And that came from our coal-fueled powered plant. Ironically enough, that did not stay open very long because they realized how unsafe it was to have that kind of power right next to a whole bunch of sleeping barrels. But this is the front of our micro distillery. I always look at this mini model as a really good representation of what we do here at Stitzel Weller, because we are a micro distillery compared to larger distilleries. Our distillery specialist, Jordan, is usually in his office. It looks a little bit like a chemistry lab because there's a lot of science it takes to go into distilling bourbon. He does distillation for Diageo Monday through Friday, and when he's not distilling for Diageo, he does do research and development for our parent company, Diageo, as well. Now, he's filling about a barrel to 2 barrels per week. It really just varies. But there are a few rules that Jordan has to follow here at Stitzel Weller when he's going through distillation. We refer to those as the ABCs of bourbon. Have y'all heard of the ABCs of bourbon before? Yes. Maybe, yeah. When I start going through them, you probably will know. So feel free. Shout out answers if you do know any of these, okay? Starting out strong. I'm going to be looking over at you, sir. You're starting out with A. Your bourbon must be made in America. It doesn't have to be made in Kentucky, but 95% of the world's supply of bourbon comes straight from Kentucky. And we credit this to our fresh flowing limestone filtered water, the same water that credits why our horses grow as big and strong and fast as they do, which is pretty cool. Now, B, your bourbon must be aged in a newly charred American white oak barrel. It can't be reused after it's been aged after it's aged bourbon, but bourbon is the first spirit that can go into this brand new barrel. C, your bourbon must be what percent corn? 51% corn. Now, it can be a mixture of any other grains you can imagine. Our distiller specialist, Jordan, was actually experimenting with mesquite when he got here, as bourbon barrels do have to age. We haven't seen the results of those just yet, but maybe in the next few years. It can also be anything. It doesn't have to be malted barley and rye, although these are oftentimes used. Now, D, your bourbon must be distilled at a maximum proof of 160. And E, your bourbon must go in the barrel at a maximum proof. Anyone know? 125, exactly. Good job, y'all. And F, last but certainly not least, I would argue the most important, there can be no additives to your bourbon. So the grains that you start with and the yeast strain that you add are the only things that can go into that bourbon besides obviously water. Now, if there's no questions on the ABCs or anything of that nature, Joan will go see the back of the distillery. Alrighty. We actually don't use these two fermentation tanks on the end because we bring our tours from here and table bottoms so that I can start putting their hands on the fermentation tanks. So they did. So unfortunately, we don't use those two on the end anymore. But probably a good idea. Welcome in, you guys. All right, let us please notice the elephant in the room. This gigantic column copper still. Imagine this times 3. This is only 1/3 of that original column copper still that was taken from Stillhouse A. Now the other 2/3 have since been melted down at Vendome, its manufacturers, and repurposed out of the Bullet facility in Shelbyville. And they oftentimes do have to get repurposed or remelted and milled again because copper is very malleable. And we can see that on this side over here. You all can't really see over here, but when we leave, I'll make sure to point it out again. The forklift bringing this big guy in actually pinched a little too hard. And so he has a little blemish, but it only adds to his character. Now, a few really interesting things about this company, Vendome. They are family owned and operated, 4th generation, right here in Louisville. If you're familiar with Louisville, it's a little city called Butchertown. And yes, it's where all of our butchers did used to reside, which is very interesting. Sometimes you might pick up a little smell down there still today. A few other really cool things about Vendome is they still provide 1/3 of the world's entire stills today. And I've heard there's a wait list that is multiple years long to get one of these stills. But fortunately, when we opened officially in 2015 again, we were able to get our hybrid still, which is right behind me, from the same company. Now, obviously, these two differ in sheer size, but also this column copper still creates a very consistent spirit. The spirit has to go through each level of filtration, making that batch extremely blended. For a hybrid still, our Jordan does have to be very specific about what he puts in here. But let's face our attention to that copper mash cooker over behind your shoulders. That is where our grains and water are heated up. Once those grains and water are heated up, they are sent into one of the 4 fermentation tanks. You might be asking me, Chandler, why 4 fermentation tanks? Well, to make one batch of Lady Bo, it does require 880 pounds of grains. That won't fit in there in one sitting, so we do have to split it up into 4 different batches. Once it's in the fermentation tank, yeast is added, and you get a little thing known as distiller's beer. It is not good, and I would not suggest trying it, but it does have the same alcohol content as a beer would have. Once you've got your distiller's beer, it is transferred through overhead pipes, and they bring it all the way over to our hybrid still. In the bottom of this hybrid still, that distiller's beer collects, it boils, and the alcohol evaporates. The water is left over, it has a higher boiling point. So the evaporated alcohol then is put through our condenser where it liquefies, and then it runs through our tails box. Now, the tails box is where you can try that product. It's referred to as White Dog. I would not suggest trying that product. It has an extremely high alcohol content and will probably burn your tongue. Now, from there, it goes into our 3-part separator. If y'all haven't heard of the 3-part separator, there's parts of bourbon you can't consume. You'll get a nasty hangover. These are called the heads and the tails. The hearts is the good stuff. How you separate these is your heads have a very low boiling point. So you'll boil off the heads first to be used for nail polish remover, hand sanitizer, it's acetone. Your hearts have the second lowest boiling point, so they will be boiled off next. That's the good stuff that ultimately goes into the barrel. But once the hearts are taken off, they do go into a condensing tank for a few days. Last thing that boils off, and it usually doesn't have to boil off because it's just left over, Jordy normally repurposes that, puts it in our still for the distillation process, but oftentimes it can be used for industry grade fuel. Think of cruise ships. It can power cruise ships, which is incredible. But it sits in the condensing tanks, your hearts do, for a few days where it can be tested before ultimately going into a barrel. Now we're moving on to our fifth key, maturation or aging. Are y'all ready to see some of our sleeping barrels? Alrighty, let's go into our rig house. Speaking of stand in the shade right here. Normally we stand under the beauty tree, but there's not much shade going on over there. Welcome over, everybody. Welcome, you guys. When the sun comes out, we'll have a little bit of shade. Normally we stand over there, but the big tree isn't giving us much shade yet.
I want to know the purpose of the bill.
Yeah, I remember.
Our DSP is 16. I said 15, it's 16. Sorry, you all. So our DSP came from us opening. About the history of this place, none of this would have been possible if it wasn't for the production of our still house A. And that's actually located behind this little brick building you see right here. Now, if we can get a better view of it when we're walking over to our still house B, I want you all to notice how it looks like a church. It actually coined us the nickname, the Cathedral of Bourbon. The far right side, which juts up significantly higher than the rest of the building, was actually home to our 65-foot column copper still. And for 25 years, this column copper still was the tallest in the world, which is incredible. Now, once that product has gone through distillation, you get your distillate. And that was actually transferred from our still house A over to that little building you see behind this beautiful oak tree. That is known as our fill house. The fill house and still house were connected by overhead pipes, so no one could get their hands on that whiskey as it was traveling from one building to another. In the fill house, there are two large cisterns, 20,000 gallons a piece. Each of those cisterns fill up, and in turn, they fill up a barrel. Now, once the barrel's filled, it is sent to one of our 18 rig houses on property. If these rig houses were at 100% capacity, they would hold over 337,000 barrels. Last I heard, our rig houses collectively are sitting at about 75 to 78% full, which is incredible. We have our we have our new bottling line, which is back in the back. You see those semis? It sits back there, and right in front of it sits train tracks. Those are the train tracks I was talking about. We currently bottle for IW Harper, Bullet, and our flagship, Blade and Bow. But our old bottling line was actually attached at the front to our still house A. Unfortunately, it was beyond repair, the damage was, and so we did just have to tear that down. But it did come all the way out to this little brick building with the key on it that we see behind us. Now, this little brick building is a tax house. With the implementation of the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897, a United States government official was said to be sent to every distillery who claimed to be bottled in bond, and we did claim to do so. He made sure that your whiskey was being taxed as soon as it came out of that rick house, and that these barrels were being stored in a federally bonded warehouse. It was the first set of rules and regulations for distilling. Now, this was implemented for us in 1935 when we officially opened here. We didn't seem to like him very much because there is no running water and there is no toilet in that tax house, unfortunately. We wanted him off this property as much as possible. Now it's used for VIP and private events, which is very interesting. But that does lead me up to 1935, where we left off talking about that history up front. Now for the next 30 years, this is known as the golden age of bourbon. During the height of Stillhouse A's production, it was filling a barrel every 4 minutes and 17 seconds. If you want to compare that to something, the Shelbyville Distillery, Bullitt's Distillery out in Shelbyville, they fill a barrel every 8 minutes today. So at the height of our production, we doubled theirs today, which is incredible. Now we are producing brands including Rebel Yell, which is now just known as Rebel, Cabin Still, Weller, and Old Fitzgerald, hence the big smokestack you all see behind your shoulder. I will talk a little bit about that more. But when the golden age of bourbon eventually was coming to an end to the mid to early 60s, Julian P. Van Winkle was the last original founder still standing. The Stitzels unfortunately had passed on, as did Alex Barnsley. And Julian P. Van Winkle says, it's time. I'm going to pass the reins down to my son, Julian Jr. And in '64, Julian Jr. takes over as president of this distillery. Now he's facing a lot of pressure from shareholders to sell this place for one reason. Bourbon sales are dropping fast for a couple of reasons. The main reason the bourbon sales declined as quickly as they did, because a little movement called counterculture. Counterculture was when bourbon was basically flipped on top of its head. Vodka, beer, wine coolers were now king. A little group called the hippies led this movement of counterculture because they were rebellious and they didn't want to drink what mom and dad were drinking. Another main reason that we saw this drastic decline in bourbon sales is because dark spirits as a whole had imposed a self-regulating advertising ban. So no longer were we seeing bourbon on TV and commercials on radios. We were seeing commercials on radio and TV about gin, vodka, beer, wine coolers, things of that nature. So the sales are dropping quick. Julian Jr. tries to hold on as long as he could, 8 years specifically, and unfortunately in 1972, he was forced to sell this place. He sold to an organization under the name of Norton Simon. Norton Simon's group came in, took one look at this place and said, you know what? Family names are out. I think renaming this place after its most popular bourbon during the Golden Age will bring back popularity to bourbon. So he named it to Old Fitzgerald Distillery and they put it up on the smokestack officially. Now this didn't do what Norton Simon thought it would do and bourbon sales kept dropping. Unfortunately at this point, this place became a revolving door, changes in ownership, acquisitions, mergers, things of that nature, up until 1992. When a group called United Distillers came, they acquired this property. They took a look around and they respected the history. They thought bringing back that nostalgia with the history of this place would boost sales. So they renamed us back to Stitzel Weller Distillery. Unfortunately, this didn't do anything for bourbon sales either, and so they were forced to shut down production. 1993 was the last year mass production took place at this distillery. Now, right before they pack up this place and leave nothing but sleeping barrels and a security guard, they made sure to sell off all of our labels that we were making during the Golden Age, which is why we don't see those original 4 labels here today. You'll see them elsewhere. Now, once United Distillers packed up and left this place, they did still own us. And 5 years later, a merger between United Distillers, Grand Metropolitan PLC, and a little organization you all might have heard of, Guinness, merged together to create our parent company today, Diageo. Diageo doesn't know what to do with this place. When they come in, they see all of these barrels sitting around, and they wait. They know that one day, bourbon will become popular again. And it did. In the early 2000s, social media brought around the popularity of bourbon again. You had YouTubers getting on talking about flavor profiles, notes you're supposed to taste. And you also have my generation, a group of rebellious individuals as well, who don't want to drink the beer and wine that mom and dad are drinking. So bourbon is popular again. And fortunately, we were able to open in 2015 with the release of our flagship brand today, blade, and bow. None of this would have been possible without opening our still house B in 2015, which is moving us into our third key, which is fermentation. This is all about change. Our change was fortunately when we opened up our still house B. Does anyone have any questions?
I think I saw the we were learning about the the license number, and I think I saw it where we were
Our DSP.
Yeah, the DSP.
Yes, so we
Did that
actually
change throughout the
sold
years?
that as
Okay.
well in 1993. They sold off our DSP, but fortunately in 2015 we were able to purchase that DSP back. So we are DSP 15. Yes, yes, it's a good one. It's a good one. All righty, if you all are ready, we're gonna go ahead and dollar back there. I don't know. Sure. Welcome in, you guys. Welcome in. See, they made this house just for us. No ducky for us. Oh, there you go. Welcome in, you guys. Welcome in, welcome in. That breeze is nice. I'm afraid it might be a little stuffy in here today.
Oh, this is what you do here.
Just what they do, yeah.
Repair.
All right. Woo! There is no airflow in here whatsoever. Okay. We'll try to keep it as brief as we possibly can. But there is one thing I want to mention to you guys about that ethanol alcohol in the air. We love that smell so much. We also have a little friend living on our property who loves that just as much. It actually feeds this little friend. By little friend, I mean a fungus. It is a black fungus that grows on all of our trees and all of our rick houses. It is called Bernardia comniacensis, and it took me 2 weeks to memorize how to say that. But it is completely harmless. Our oak trees, all of our trees are beautiful, and they've been here for 60, 70 years. And Julian P. Van Winkle was here every single day and lived to the age of 91. But welcome in. This is our Cooper shop where barrels were sent to repair. It was said every single morning they sent a few employees around to each of these rick houses. Since there were 18, it probably took them quite a while. They look at every single barrel, mark where the barrels were leaking, and those leaky barrels would be rolled over here on the barrel side to our Cooper shop. This was actually moved from being in between our fill house and rick house, so they didn't have to roll as far. But now it's out of use. We want it to be on the tour path. These barrels were taken and rolled up on 2 4x4 planks up on top of these troughs. It did take 3 men. They weigh 500 pounds when they're full to 550 pounds. Now, these were put up on the trough, but not before the taxman who's sitting in the corner weighed your barrel before and after to make sure you were not stealing any of that bourbon. So these barrels were taken down to the ground, and then these rings cooler in here, unfortunately.
False advertising, false advertising.
Welcome in, everybody. See if we can get us all up here. I get to squeeze back a little bit. Hopefully my voice isn't too loud for you. Welcome in, you guys. This is our Rick House Inn. Now you might be wondering why in the world is it called a Rick House? I've got the real answer, and I have got the answer we say here at Stitzel. The real answer is because these wooden beams that these barrels sit on are referred to as ricks, hence the name a Rick House. But the fun answer we like to say here at Stitzel is that our founder, Frederick Stitzel, actually patented this exact design of warehouses. Now, this design that he patented in 1879 has since been utilized across the world for aging bourbon. And that's because it allows one crucial thing to maturing barrels: airflow, which allows for the fluctuation of temperature. On a normal day that isn't as hot, it's about 10 to 15 degrees cooler right inside these doors than it is right outside. Also 10 to 15 degrees hotter on the 7th floor. Those barrels do age at a quicker pace. Now, Kentucky is also really, really good at aging bourbon because we have 4 distinct seasons. During our extremely hot and humid summers, these staves are forced to expand. The bourbon on the inside has nowhere else to go but inside these staves. During our extremely cold winters, these staves are contracting. And so the bourbon is pulled out of those staves, bringing with it all of its color it got from the char on the inside of these barrels, and 75% of its flavor does also come from the char on the inside, which is incredible. Now, due to that expansion and contraction, we do lose some bourbon. We refer to this loss as the little red line because unfortunately, Devil's Cut got patented by another company, so we can no longer refer to it as the Devil's Cut, but it is the little red line. When this bourbon is contracted back out of these staves, it doesn't give it all back to us. You can see there is a line down the middle of bourbon we will never get back. This was involuntary. We did not want to give this away. It was taken from us. If you want to pass that down so everyone can see, it might be a little bit dusty, but it is okay. Now, we also lose bourbon each year due to evaporation. I heard a few people say, ooh, it smells so good when you're walking in here. That is that ethanol alcohol from the inside of your barrel being evaporated. Now, we refer to this as the angel's share because we give it to the angels willingly each year so they can keep us safe from theft, natural disasters, and fire. Which I'm not going to say too loudly in here. If all these windows were closed and the doors were closed, and you lit a match in here, you would not want to be in this building. It would just catch fire, unfortunately. Now, we lose 3 to 5% of the contents of these barrels every single year, meaning after 10 years, you might have a barrel that is 30 to 50% less full, but don't worry, it's still being taxed at a 100% increase. Now, you might notice on some of these barrels, there's like a little bit of seeping, especially on these with the bung holes on the side. Now, I will mention, those are Bulleit's barrels. They actually age their barrels sitting up and down and not on their sides. That's why the bung hole is on the top and not the side like the other barrels you see around here are. But you might notice some seeping. It looks like a little bit of sugar, kind of caramelized a little bit. That's exactly what it is. We have laser cutting technology that cuts these staves today so precisely that they are able to self-heal themselves, which is incredible. The sugars on the inside of those barrels clump together and form kind of a scab or a band-aid, and so they won't leak any longer. But back during the golden age, they didn't have this laser cutting technology, and so fortunately there was a repair shop on property referred to as the Cooper shop, a cooperage where they can repair and fix our barrels, which is a very natural part of the maturing process. Does anyone have any questions before we head on over to our Cooper shop?
Do you guys move these around?
We do not move our barrels around